We tell ourselves that the great catastrophes belong to myth. The drowned continents, the worlds swept away by flood, the lost civilizations that vanished before history began. We imagine that the end of a world is something that happens only in legend, in the deep and unverifiable past, in stories we can neither prove nor truly fear. But there was a time when the world really ended, not in myth, not in prehistory, in history, in a period we can date, in a region we can map, among civilizations we can name, whose letters we can still read. There was a real apocalypse, a genuine collapse of the entire civilized world, and it happened around 3,200 years ago, and almost no one remembers it. Picture the world as it was just before, a brilliant, connected, cosmopolitan world, stretched across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Great empires, rich and powerful, trading with one another across vast distances. Egypt, at the height of its glory, ruled by its famous pharaohs. The Hittite Empire, a superpower spanning what is now Turkey, rivaling Egypt itself. The Mycenaean Greeks, the world of the heroes later remembered in the tales of Troy, with their great palaces and their warrior kings, wealthy trading cities on the coasts, their harbors full of ships, kings who wrote letters to one another, calling each other brother, exchanging gifts of gold and lapis lazuli, arranging marriages, complaining about delayed shipments. A whole international order, sophisticated and interconnected, a globalized world before globalization, humming with commerce and diplomacy and art. And then, in the span of a single lifetime, it was gone. All of it. Not one kingdom fell. Nearly all of them fell, almost at once. The Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the age, simply collapsed and disappeared, its capital abandoned and burned, its very existence forgotten so completely that for thousands of years no one even knew it had been there. The Mycenaean world of Greece came apart, its palaces destroyed, its cities emptied. The great trading cities of the coast were burned to the ground, and many were never rebuilt. Across the entire region, city after city after city was destroyed in a wave of fire, a horizon of ash and ruin that archaeologists can still trace in the earth. And in the aftermath came a darkness. Trade routes broke. Populations crashed. And most hauntingly of all, in some places, writing itself was forgotten. The ability to read and write, that most basic mark of civilization, was lost and would not return for centuries. A world that had been literate went silent. This is not a legend. This is one of the most thoroughly documented catastrophes in human history. And it is one of the greatest mysteries in human history at the same time, because here is the thing that has haunted historians for generations. We know it happened. We can see the burned cities, read the last desperate letters, map the collapse, but we do not know with certainty why. What force or forces could bring down an entire civilized world, a whole interconnected system of superpowers, almost simultaneously in one generation? The Egyptians left an answer of a kind. They carved it into their temple walls. They said that enemies came from the sea, a great confederation of peoples surging out of the water, sweeping across the world, toppling kingdom after kingdom. The Egyptians called them, in effect, the peoples of the sea, and they remain to this day one of the great unsolved mysteries of history, because we do not know for certain who they were, where they came from, or whether they were the cause of the catastrophe or merely another symptom of it. Tonight we are going to tell the story of the year the world ended, the real one. We are going to build the glittering world that was lost, and then watch it fall, city by city, empire by empire. We are going to investigate the mystery of who or what destroyed it, From the enemies who came out of the sea to the changing climate to the tangle of causes the evidence actually points toward. And we are going to confront the most unsettling thing of all, that the world which ended was, in its way, not so unlike our own, connected, sophisticated, interdependent, fragile. It happened once to a world that thought it would last forever. Let us find out how. Welcome. Ask most people to name a great collapse of civilization, and they will reach for one of two things. They will reach for a myth like Atlantis, the drowned continent that may never have existed at all. Or they will reach for the fall of Rome, the slow unraveling of an empire over centuries, a decline so gradual that historians still argue about when or even whether it truly ended. What almost no one reaches for, because almost no one knows about it, is the catastrophe that was faster, more total, and in many ways more mysterious than either. The collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, the real end of a real world, around 1200 years before the Common Era, when the entire civilized order of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East came crashing down nearly all at once in the space of a few decades. This is the apocalypse that history forgot, and the strange thing is how completely it was forgotten, not just by us, but by the ages that followed it. The collapse was so severe that it erased much of the memory of the world that came before. When writing was lost, the records went with it. When the palaces fell, the administrators who kept the accounts were gone. Whole civilizations vanished so thoroughly that later peoples had no idea they had ever existed. The Hittite Empire, one of the mightiest powers of its day, a rival to Egypt itself, was so completely erased that for thousands of years it was known only from a few puzzling references in other people's texts. Its ruins unrecognized, its language unread, its very reality doubted, until archaeologists in relatively modern times rediscovered it and slowly realized that an entire lost superpower had been sitting in the historical record all along, unrecognized. An empire so great and so thoroughly forgotten that the world lost track of it for 3,000 years. That is the scale of what we are dealing with. Not a decline, but an erasure. And this is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so profoundly worth understanding and so different from the other catastrophes we might explore. Let me be clear at the outset about what makes this particular apocalypse so special, because it shapes everything about how we are going to approach it. Most stories of lost worlds and great collapses live in the realm of speculation. They ask us to believe in things for which the evidence is thin or absent: drowned continents, prehistoric supercivilizations, cataclysms we can only imagine. And the honest examination of those stories usually means deflating them, separating the exciting legend from the disappointing reality. But the Bronze Age collapse is the opposite kind of story. It is not a legend that shrinks under scrutiny. It is a documented historical event that only grows more astonishing the closer you look. It really happened. We can date it, we can map it, we can read the actual letters written by the actual people who lived through it, some of them written in the final days before their cities burned. The destruction layers are real, visible in the earth, a horizon of ash that archaeologists can trace across the whole region. This is not a mystery we have to invent. It is a mystery we have inherited, solid and factual, and genuinely unsolved. And that changes the whole nature of our honest examination. In other subjects, our task is to ask whether the astonishing thing really happened, and usually to conclude that it did not, or that it has an ordinary explanation. Here, the astonishing thing did happen. The debate is not about whether an entire civilized world collapsed almost simultaneously. It did. The debate is about why. And that debate is real live and genuinely open, conducted not by fringe theorists, but by serious historians and archaeologists who have proposed a whole range of explanations and who continue to argue about them, because the evidence, though rich, does not point cleanly to a single answer. This is a case where the mainstream itself holds the mystery, where the honest position is not skepticism toward a wild claim, but humility before a genuine puzzle. So let me set out the honest frame that will guide us through this entire journey, because it is a little different from our usual approach, and the difference matters. There are things about the Bronze Age collapse that we know with real confidence, and there are things we genuinely do not know, and the whole art of understanding this subject lies in keeping those two categories clear. Here is what we know. We know that around the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 12th century before the Common Era, a brilliant interconnected civilization spanned the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. We know that within a few decades, most of it collapsed. We know that cities across the region were destroyed, many by fire, in a wave of devastation. We know that the great powers fell, the Hittites vanishing entirely, the Mycenaean Greeks unraveling, others crippled. We know that Egypt recorded battles against mysterious enemies from the sea. We know that trade routes broke, that populations declined, that in places writing was lost, and that a dark age followed, lasting centuries. All of this is established, documented, real. It is the solid ground beneath our feet. And here is what we do not know. We do not know with certainty what caused it. We do not know for sure who the sea peoples were, where they came from, or what role they truly played, cause or symptom, invaders or refugees, or both. We do not know exactly how the different factors, invasion, drought, famine, earthquake, internal collapse, fit together, or which mattered most. We do not know why the collapse was so total, why so many independent kingdoms fell so close together in time. These are real, open questions, and anyone who tells you they have been definitively answered is claiming more than the evidence allows. The genuine mystery is not manufactured. It is really there at the heart of one of the best documented catastrophes in history. This is the honest frame, and it is a thrilling one because it means we do not have to choose between wonder and truth. The wonder is the truth. The collapse really happened, and it really is unexplained. Our task is not to inflate a myth or deflate a legend, but to explore a genuine historical mystery with the seriousness it deserves, to lay out what we know and what we do not, to weigh the competing explanations fairly, and to feel the full weight of a real apocalypse, one that happened to real people in a real and recoverable world. Here is the road ahead. We will begin by building that lost world, by coming to know and even to love the glittering cosmopolitan civilization of the late Bronze Age, the great powers and their kings and their letters, because you cannot feel the tragedy of a collapse until you feel the value of what was lost. Then we will examine the deep interdependence of that world, the web of trade and bronze that bound it together, and the hidden fragility inside that connection. Then we will watch it fall, the wave of destruction sweeping across the region, superpower after superpower collapsing almost at once. We will descend into a single city, Ugarit, and read its last letters written as the end arrived. We will confront the great mystery of the sea peoples, the enemies from the water. We will investigate the deeper causes, the drought and famine that the science increasingly reveals, the earthquakes and wars and internal collapses. We will draw it all together into the modern understanding of how a connected world can fall in a cascade, a perfect storm of overlapping catastrophes. And finally, we will explore the long darkness that followed and confront the unsettling mirror this ancient collapse holds up to our own connected, fragile, global world. Because that is the deepest reason this forgotten apocalypse deserves to be remembered. It is not just a story about the distant past. It is a story about what can happen to a civilization like the one they had, and perhaps like the one we have. A sophisticated, interconnected, seemingly permanent world that ended anyway. Let us go back then to that world at its height, before the fall, and see what it was that the year the world ended took away. Let us enter the glittering world of the late Bronze Age. To understand a tragedy, you must first understand what was lost. And so, before we watch the world end, we have to build it, to walk through it while it still stood, to feel the wealth and the sophistication and the sheer human achievement of the civilization that was about to be destroyed. Because the collapse at the end of the Bronze Age is not merely the story of some burned cities, it is the story of the end of a golden age, a brilliant, cosmopolitan, interconnected world at the very height of its powers. Let us go back then to that world in its glory in the centuries before the fall and see what it was. The late Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East was an age of great powers. Not one dominant empire, but several coexisting, competing, trading, a whole system of major civilizations sharing a connected world. Let us meet them, because these are the players whose fall will define our story. First and greatest in fame was Egypt. This was Egypt near the height of its imperial power, the Egypt of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, an age of monumental building, military power, and vast wealth. This was the Egypt of some of the most famous rulers in all of history, of enormous temples and towering statues, of a civilization already ancient and still magnificent, its power radiating across the region. Egypt was a superpower, wealthy and militarily formidable, its influence reaching up into the lands of the eastern Mediterranean coast, a great and confident civilization at the peak of its imperial age. To the north, in the land that is now Turkey, stood a power that rivaled Egypt itself, though it is far less remembered today, the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were one of the great superpowers of the late Bronze Age, ruling a vast territory across Anatolia and into the lands to the south, a mighty empire with a powerful army, a sophisticated administration, and a great capital city. The Hittites were serious rivals to Egypt, so much so that the two superpowers fought one of the most famous battles of the ancient world against each other, and later concluded one of the earliest known peace treaties in human history, a formal agreement between two great powers, preserved and remembered. The Hittites were a first-rank civilization, a genuine superpower, and their existence is central to our story because their fall would be one of the most complete and shocking of all. To the west, across the sea, in Greece and the Aegean, flourished the world of the Mycenaeans. This was the civilization of the Bronze Age Greeks, the world that would later be remembered dimly and gloriously in the great epic poems of Homer, the world of the heroes of the legendary war at Troy. The Mycenaeans were a civilization of powerful warrior kings ruling from great fortified palaces, centers of power crowned with massive stone walls so imposing that later Greeks, gazing at the ruins, believed they must have been built by giants. The Mycenaeans were sophisticated, wealthy, and far-reaching. Their goods and their influence spread across the Mediterranean, a proud and formidable civilization at its height. And they too would fall. And these were not the only powers. There were others, kingdoms and empires and city-states woven into the same world. There was the kingdom centered in Mesopotamia, the ancient heartland of civilization with its own great cities and long traditions. There were the wealthy trading cities and kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean coast, in the lands that are now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, prosperous centers of commerce sitting at the crossroads of the great powers. There was the island of Cyprus, rich in the copper that gave the Bronze Age its name, a vital hub in the network of trade. And there were smaller kingdoms and peoples throughout, each with its place in the larger order. This was not a single empire, but a whole international system, a community of civilizations spread across a vast region, all interconnected, all part of one glittering world. And here is what is truly remarkable about this world, the thing that makes it feel so surprisingly modern, so vivid, so real. It was cosmopolitan, it was connected, it was, in its way, an early version of an international order with diplomacy, trade, and communication flowing between the great powers across enormous distances. This was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, each ignorant of the others. It was a connected community of states, aware of one another, engaged with one another, bound together by commerce and diplomacy and shared prestige. We know this with wonderful, intimate detail because of one of the most extraordinary sources to survive from the ancient world, the letters. Archaeologists have recovered actual diplomatic correspondence between the great kings of this age, letters written on clay tablets, exchanged between the courts of Egypt, the Hittites, and the other powers, and preserved by chance through the millennia. And reading these letters is like eavesdropping on the diplomacy of a lost world, and it brings that world startlingly to life. In these letters, the great kings address one another as brothers. They write to one another as equals, as members of an exclusive club of royal power, calling each other my brother, inquiring after each other's health and families, maintaining the elaborate courtesies of international diplomacy. They exchange lavish gifts, gold and silver, precious stones like lapis lazuli, fine textiles, luxury goods, horses, sending treasures back and forth as expressions of friendship and status. They arrange marriages between royal houses, sealing alliances by sending princesses from one court to another. They negotiate, they bargain, they complain. There are letters grumbling that the gold sent by another king was of poor quality, or that a promised shipment was delayed, or that a messenger was detained too long. There are the small frictions and the grand gestures of a real, functioning international system conducted between kings who ruled empires and who treated one another across the vast distances as brothers in a shared world of power. Think about what this reveals. This was a world of genuine internationalism, of sustained diplomatic relationships between great powers separated by hundreds of miles, of a shared culture of kingship and prestige that spanned the entire region. The kings of Egypt and the Hittites and the other powers knew one another, dealt with one another, saw themselves as part of a common order of civilization. It was sophisticated, it was interconnected, and it was, for its time, astonishingly cosmopolitan. And the sophistication went far beyond diplomacy. This was a world of great art and craftsmanship, of skilled artisans producing exquisite goods, fine metalwork, jewelry, carved ivory, painted pottery, luxurious textiles. It was a world of monumental architecture, of palaces and temples and fortifications built on a grand scale. It was a world of writing and record-keeping, of literate administrations tracking the complex business of palace economies, recording trade, taxation, and inventory on clay tablets and in other scripts. It was a world of specialized labor, of skilled professionals, scribes and craftsmen and merchants and soldiers, a complex, differentiated society. This was a mature, sophisticated civilization, or rather a whole family of them, at a high level of achievement, comparable in its complexity and its accomplishment to any age that had come before. And it was wealthy. The palaces overflowed with goods. The trade routes carried luxury items across the whole region and beyond. The elites lived in comfort and splendor, surrounded by the fine things that flowed through the networks of commerce. This was a prosperous age, an age of abundance for those at the top of its societies, a glittering world of wealth and beauty and power. Stand in that world for a moment before we let it fall. Imagine the great palaces with their painted walls and their storerooms full of goods. Imagine the harbors crowded with ships carrying copper and tin and grain and luxury wares between the kingdoms. Imagine the scribes bent over their tablets, recording the business of empires. Imagine the kings in their courts, dictating letters to their royal brothers across the sea, exchanging gifts of gold, arranging the marriages of princes and princesses. Imagine a whole connected world, sophisticated, prosperous, cosmopolitan, humming with commerce and diplomacy and art, an international order that had endured for centuries and must have seemed to those who lived within it as permanent and unshakable as the world itself. This was the glittering world of the late Bronze Age, and it was about to be destroyed almost in its entirety in the span of a single human lifetime. But before we watch it fall, we have to understand one more thing about this world, one crucial feature that made it both magnificent and vulnerable. Because the very interconnection that made this civilization so glorious, the trade, the exchange, the mutual dependence of the kingdoms, was also hidden within it a profound and dangerous fragility. To understand how the whole world could fall almost at once, we have to understand the web that bound it together, the web of bronze itself. Let us look now at the connections that made this world, and at the vulnerability hidden inside them. We have seen the glittering world of the late Bronze Age in its splendor, but now we have to understand something deeper about it, something that will turn out to be the key to the entire mystery of its collapse, because this world was not merely connected in the way that any group of neighboring kingdoms is connected. It was interconnected at a profound and structural level, bound together by ties of trade and dependence so deep that the kingdoms were not really separate systems at all, but parts of a single integrated whole. And hidden inside that magnificent interconnection was a vulnerability, a fragility that would prove catastrophic. To understand how the whole world could fall almost at once, we must understand the web that bound it together. And that web begins with the very metal that gives the age its name, bronze. Consider bronze itself and what it meant to this world. Bronze was the essential material of the age, the metal from which the most important tools and weapons were made. Bronze was used for the swords and spearheads and armor of the armies, for the tools of the craftsmen, for vessels and implements and countless objects of daily and elite life. It was the high technology of its era, the material that equipped the soldiers and the workers and the palaces. A civilization's power, in a real sense, rested on its access to bronze. And this is where the crucial fact enters, the fact that bound the whole world together and made it fragile at the same time. Bronze is not a single metal that you can dig out of the ground. Bronze is an alloy. It is made by combining two different metals, copper and tin. And this simple fact of metallurgy had enormous consequences because copper and tin are not found in the same places. To make bronze, you needed both, and to get both, you needed trade, often over very long distances. copper was relatively available in the eastern Mediterranean world. The island of Cyprus, in particular, was rich in copper, so rich that its very name is bound up with the metal, and it served as a major source for the whole region. Copper could be obtained, traded, moved through the networks of commerce. But tin was another matter entirely. Tin was rare, and its sources were distant, in some cases very distant indeed, lying far from the centers of the Bronze Age world, reached only through long and complex chains of trade that stretched across great distances over land and sea from remote sources into the heart of the civilized world. Tin had to travel far to reach the places where bronze was made, passing through many hands along extended routes in a supply chain of remarkable length and complexity for its time. Think about what this means. The single most important material of the entire civilization, the metal of its weapons and tools, could only be produced by combining two components that came from different places, one of them rare and distant, delivered only through long-distance trade. This means that no kingdom, however powerful, was truly self-sufficient in the essential material of its own power. Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, none of them could simply produce bronze on their own from local resources alone. They all depended on trade, on the movement of copper, and especially tin across the networks that connected the world, to obtain the metal on which their armies and their economies rested. The great powers were bound together and bound to the trade routes by their common dependence on bronze. And bronze was only the most vivid example of a much broader interdependence. The whole economy of this world was built on trade, on the movement of goods across the region. Grain moved between kingdoms, some regions producing surpluses that fed others. Luxury goods flowed through the networks, the gold and ivory and fine crafts that adorned the palaces. Timber, oil, wine, textiles, precious stones, all manner of commodities moved along the trade routes, by ship across the sea and by caravan over land, in a constant circulation of goods that linked the kingdoms into a single economic system. The prosperity of this world, its wealth and its splendor, rested on the flow of trade, on the connections between the kingdoms, on the routes and the ships and the merchants that carried the goods from place to place. And the way this trade was organized added another layer of both sophistication and fragility. Much of it was managed through what scholars call the palace economies. The great palaces were not just royal residences. They were economic centers, hubs of administration that organized and controlled much of the production, storage, and exchange of goods. The palace collected surpluses, stored them in great storerooms, managed the labor of craftsmen, organized trade, and redistributed goods through the society. The scribes and administrators of the palace tracked all of this on their tablets, recording the inflows and outflows, managing the complex business of a centralized economy. This system was efficient and sophisticated, capable of organizing large-scale production and long-distance trade, but it was also centralized, concentrated, dependent on the palace and its administration functioning smoothly. If the palace failed, the whole economic system it managed could fail with it. So picture the structure of this world now, not just as a collection of kingdoms, but as a single integrated system. The kingdoms were bound together by trade, dependent on one another and on the routes that connected them. The essential material of the age, bronze, required long-distance trade to produce, tying every power to the networks of exchange. The economies were organized through centralized palace systems, efficient but concentrated and vulnerable. And the whole thing rested on the continued flow of goods, the continued functioning of the trade routes, the continued stability of the connections between the parts. It was a marvel of interconnection, a genuine international economic system, sophisticated and productive and rich. But do you see the vulnerability hidden inside it? The very interconnection that made this world so prosperous also made it fragile in a particular and dangerous way. Because in a highly interconnected system, where every part depends on the others, a disruption in one place does not stay in one place. It spreads. If the trade routes are broken, every kingdom that depends on them suffers all at once. If the supply of tin is cut off, bronze production falters across the whole world, not just in one country. If one major center collapses, the shock ripples outward to all the others connected to it. The connections that carried prosperity in good times could carry catastrophe in bad times. The web that bound the world together could transmit disaster as efficiently as it transmitted wealth. This is the crucial insight, and it is the thread that will run through everything that follows. The late Bronze Age world was not a set of independent kingdoms that could fall one at a time, each collapse contained. It was an integrated system, a web in which the parts were deeply dependent on one another. And integrated systems have a particular property. They are strong and efficient and prosperous when things are going well, but they are vulnerable to a specific and terrifying kind of failure. Cascade, chain reaction, systemic collapse, in which a disruption in one part spreads through the connections to the whole, and the very interdependence that was a strength becomes suddenly a fatal weakness, transmitting the failure everywhere at once. We will return to this idea again and again because it lies at the heart of the modern understanding of the collapse. And at the heart of the unsettling mirror, this ancient catastrophe holds up to our own world. For now, simply hold on to it. This world was gloriously, prosperously, sophisticatedly interconnected. And that very interconnection, the web of bronze and trade and palace economies that bound it together, was also a hidden fragility, a vulnerability to cascading collapse, waiting for the shock that would set it off. And the shock came. Or rather, the shocks came, more than one, converging on this interconnected world in a single terrible period. And the web that had carried prosperity for centuries began, instead, to carry catastrophe, transmitting destruction from kingdom to kingdom until nearly the whole glittering world lay in ruins. It is time now to watch it happen. It is time to watch the world end. Let us turn to the collapse itself, the wave of destruction that swept across the Bronze Age world in the span of a single generation. Now we come to the catastrophe itself. We have built the glittering world and understood the web that bound it together. Now we watch it fall. And the most staggering thing about the collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, the thing that separates it from an ordinary decline, is its speed and its scope. This was not a slow fading over centuries. This was a collapse that unfolded across the region in the span of a few decades, a single human lifetime. And it brought down not one kingdom, but nearly all of them, almost at once. Superpower after superpower, city after city, falling in a wave of destruction that swept across the entire civilized world. Let us watch it happen. Archaeologists have a term for the physical evidence of this catastrophe, and it is a chilling one. They speak of a destruction horizon. When they excavate the cities of this world, digging down through the layers of earth that record the passage of time, they find, at a certain level corresponding to the end of the Bronze Age, a layer of destruction, a layer of ash, of burning, of collapse and ruin. City after city across the whole region shows this same terrible signature at roughly the same time, a horizon of destruction running through the earth, marking the moment when the world burned. This is not speculation. It is physical, visible, recoverable evidence, a layer of catastrophe preserved in the ground, found at site after site across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The destruction was real, it was widespread, and it was concentrated in a relatively narrow band of time. The earth itself records the year the world ended. Let us trace the fall, power by power, because the scale only becomes clear when you see how many great civilizations went down together. Begin with the Hittites, one of the two great superpowers of the age, the mighty empire of Anatolia. Their fall was among the most complete and shocking of all. The Hittite Empire, that vast and powerful state, rival to Egypt, master of a great territory, simply collapsed. Its great capital city, the seat of its power, was abandoned and destroyed, burned, left in ruins. The empire that had endured for centuries, that had fought Egypt to a standstill and concluded treaties as a first-rank power, came apart and vanished. And vanished is the right word, because the Hittite collapse was so total that, as we noted at the outset, the empire was essentially erased from history, forgotten so completely that for thousands of years the world did not even know it had existed. A superpower, gone, its capital in ashes, its very memory extinguished. This was not a decline. This was an annihilation. Turn to the west, to the Mycenaean world of Greece, the civilization of the warrior kings and the great palace fortresses. It too came apart. The great Mycenaean palaces, those centers of power crowned with massive walls, were destroyed, many of them burned. The sophisticated palace civilization of Bronze Age Greece unraveled, its centers ruined, its system of administration and power collapsing. The Mycenaean world, the world later remembered in the heroic legends, the world of the tales of Troy, fell into ruin. And in the aftermath, Greece entered a profound dark age, a long period of decline and diminishment, of which we will speak more later. The proud civilization of the Mycenaeans, with its palaces and its warrior kings, was shattered, and it continued across the region. The wealthy trading cities and kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean coast, those prosperous centers at the crossroads of the world, were struck. City after city was destroyed, many burned, some never to be rebuilt. The great city of Ugarit, to which we will devote our next chapter, was destroyed and abandoned, never reoccupied, its ruins left silent. Other cities and kingdoms along the coast and inland fell into destruction or decline. The network of prosperous centers that had studded the region was torn apart, its cities burning, its trade collapsing. Across the whole interconnected world, the same story repeated: destruction, fire, abandonment, collapse. The great powers and the smaller kingdoms alike struck down in a wave that swept across the entire region in a relatively short span of time. Not every single settlement was destroyed, and the pattern was complex, with some places hit harder than others and some surviving better. But the overall picture is unmistakable and overwhelming. The interconnected civilization of the late Bronze Age, that glittering world of great powers and cosmopolitan trade, collapsed across its whole extent, almost simultaneously, in a catastrophe of astonishing scope and speed. There was one great power that did not fall, and its survival is instructive. Egypt endured. Egypt, the ancient and mighty civilization of the Nile, survived the collapse. But even Egypt did not emerge unscathed. Egypt faced the catastrophe directly, fought against the enemies who came out of the sea, as we will see, and though it survived those battles, it emerged weakened, diminished, its empire and its power reduced. In the period after the collapse, Egypt entered a phase of decline and difficulty, its golden age of imperial power passing. So even the great survivor was crippled, wounded by the catastrophe, its glory fading in the aftermath. Egypt lived, but the world it had lived in was gone, and Egypt itself was never quite the same. Step back and take in the totality of this. In the space of a few decades, around the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 12th century before the Common Era, the entire civilized world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East collapsed. The Hittite Empire annihilated and forgotten. The Mycenaean world shattered into a dark age. The trading cities of the coast burned and in many cases abandoned forever. Kingdom after kingdom, power after power, falling in a wave of destruction. And even mighty Egypt, the great survivor, left weakened and declining. An entire international order, a whole family of sophisticated civilizations, brought down almost at once. This is the scale of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is why it deserves to be called, without exaggeration, the year the world ended or the generation the world ended. A whole world gone. And now we confront the central question, the question that has haunted historians for generations, the question this entire documentary is built around: how? How could this happen? How could an entire interconnected world, a system of great powers that had endured for centuries, collapse so completely, so widely, so nearly all at once? What force or forces could bring down the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and the cities of the coast, could shatter the whole civilized order in a single generation? This is the great mystery, and it is genuinely unsolved. We will spend the heart of this documentary investigating it, weighing the theories, examining the evidence. But we will approach it, as historians do, by first getting as close as we possibly can to the actual moment of collapse, to the experience of the people who lived through it. Because the collapse was not an abstraction, it happened to real people in real cities in real time, and by an extraordinary stroke of fortune, we have a window into the very last days of one of those cities. A window so vivid, so immediate, so heartbreaking, that it brings the whole catastrophe into sharp and human focus. We have the last letters of a city called Ugarit, written in its final days, some of them perhaps in its final hours, and preserved by a terrible irony, by the very fire that destroyed the city. Let us descend now from the great sweep of the collapse to a single city caught in the act of dying, and read the words its people left behind. Let us go to Ugarit. The collapse of the Bronze Age is a vast event, spanning a whole region, involving empires and superpowers and forces we can barely reconstruct. But history, at its most powerful, is not made of abstractions. It is made of moments, of individual human experiences, of specific people facing specific catastrophes. And by an extraordinary and haunting stroke of fortune, we have a window into one such moment, into the very last days of a single city as the collapse engulfed it. That city was Ugarit, and its final testimony is one of the most chilling and moving things to survive from the entire ancient world. Let us descend now from the great sweep of the collapse to the streets of one doomed city, and let us hear what its people said in the end. First, let us understand what Ugarit was, because to feel the tragedy of its end, we must know the richness of its life. Ugarit was a wealthy and important city on the eastern Mediterranean coast. in the north of what is now Syria, a thriving center of trade sitting at a crossroads of the ancient world. It was perfectly positioned to prosper in the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, a hub where the trade routes met, where goods and peoples and influences from many cultures converged. Through its harbor and its markets flowed the commerce of the age, and Ugarit grew rich upon it. It was a cosmopolitan place, in contact with all the great powers, home to merchants and craftsmen and scribes, a prosperous and sophisticated city fully woven into the glittering world we have described. And Ugarit was a literate city, a city of writing and records, and this is what makes its testimony so precious. The people of Ugarit kept extensive records on clay tablets in several languages and scripts, documenting the business and the diplomacy and the administration of their city. They had archives, collections of tablets recording their affairs, the letters they sent and received, the accounts they kept, the business they transacted. Ugarit was a city that wrote things down, that preserved its correspondence, that maintained written records of its dealings with the wider world. And it is through these records, and especially through the last of them, that we can hear the voice of the city in its final days, because Ugarit was destroyed. In the wave of collapse that swept the region, Ugarit fell. The city was attacked, destroyed, and burned. And crucially, it was never rebuilt, never reoccupied. It was abandoned, left in ruins, its life extinguished. And here is the terrible irony, the thing that preserved its testimony for us. The tablets of Ugarit were made of clay, and clay, when it is fired, when it is baked hard in intense heat, becomes durable, preserved, fixed. In the ordinary course of things, many clay tablets were left unfired, meant to be temporary, and they would eventually crumble. But the fire that destroyed Ugarit, the very conflagration that ended the city, baked its clay tablets hard, firing them in the heat of the city's destruction, preserving them, fixing the words upon them for 3,000 years. The catastrophe that killed the city preserved its final words. The fire that was its end became the reason we can still read its last letters, and what those last letters say is extraordinary and chilling and immediate in a way that reaches across the millennia and seizes you by the throat. Because among the final documents of Ugarit are letters written in the very last period of the city's life as the danger closed in, as the crisis engulfed it. And they speak directly and desperately of the catastrophe unfolding. There are letters that speak of enemy ships, letters describing ships of the enemy appearing, causing destruction, burning towns, wreaking havoc along the coast. Letters that convey alarm, urgency, desperation, as the city and its rulers confront an enemy coming from the sea, an enemy attacking, destroying, burning. In one of the most famous and haunting of these letters, a plea for help, the writer describes the desperate situation, the enemy ships arriving, the enemy setting fire to towns and doing terrible things in the land. The letters speak of a city under threat, of an enemy attacking, of a desperate need for help, of forces that seem to be overwhelming the defenses. There is a particular and heartbreaking dimension to some of this correspondence. There are indications that Ugarit's own forces, its army and its ships, were away, absent, deployed elsewhere, perhaps sent to aid an overlord or to defend other fronts, leaving the city itself exposed and undefended at the moment of its greatest peril. Imagine the horror of that. A city facing an enemy from the sea, and its own defenders gone, its ships elsewhere, its army absent, the city left vulnerable at the very moment the enemy arrived. The letters convey a sense of a city caught unprepared, exposed, calling out for help that may never have come. And then the silence. Because these letters, some of them, were never sent. They were found in the ruins of the city, baked in the fire of its destruction. Letters that had been written but perhaps never dispatched, or received but never answered, frozen in the moment of the catastrophe. The final correspondence of a dying city, preserved in the ashes, a cry for help caught forever in the clay. We can read today the words of people facing the end of their world, in some cases perhaps in the very hours before their city burned. There is almost nothing else like it in the record of the ancient world, this direct, immediate human testimony from inside a collapsing civilization, preserved by the very fire that consumed it. Sit with the power of that. We are not reading a later historian's account of the collapse, written at a safe distance. We are reading the actual words of the actual people who lived through it, written as it happened, describing the enemy ships and the burning towns and the desperate need for help, and then falling silent as the city died. It is as close as history ever lets us come to standing inside a catastrophe, hearing the voices of those it destroyed. The last letters of Ugarit are a message from the year the world ended, written by the hands of the dying, preserved by the fire that killed them, and delivered 3,000 years late to us. And Ugarit's end, in its terrible specificity, opens onto the great mystery at the heart of our whole story. Because who were these enemies, these ships from the sea that the letters describe? Who was the enemy that burned Ugarit and, it seems, so many other cities across the region? The letters speak of an enemy coming from the water, attacking, burning, destroying, and this connects Ugarit's fall to the single most famous and most mysterious element of the entire Bronze Age collapse, the enemies that the Egyptians would record on their temple walls, the mysterious peoples who came out of the sea. Ugarit gives us the catastrophe from the inside, the human experience of the end, but it also gives us the central question: who did this? Who were the ships from the sea? To pursue that question, we must travel to Egypt, to the great survivor, whose monuments preserve the most detailed account we have of the mysterious enemy. We must confront the sea peoples, the invaders nobody can name, the great enigma at the center of the collapse. Let us turn to them now. We arrive now at the heart of the mystery, at the single most famous, most evocative, and most genuinely puzzling element of the entire Bronze Age collapse: the enemy. The force that the last letters of Ugarit describe coming out of the sea, the invaders that Egypt fought and recorded, the peoples who have become, in the popular imagination, the villains of the whole catastrophe, the destroyers who swept across the world and brought the glittering age to its end. They are known, from the Egyptian records that describe them, by a name that is itself a kind of poetry of mystery: the Sea Peoples, and they are to this day one of the great unsolved enigmas of history. Let us confront them now in their full drama, and then examine honestly how much we actually know, which is far less than the dramatic version suggests. Our most important source for the Sea Peoples is Egypt, the great survivor, whose monuments preserve the fullest account of the mysterious enemy. The Egyptian pharaohs of the period recorded on the walls of their great temples their battles against invading forces, and it is from these Egyptian records that the whole idea of the Sea Peoples comes. And what the Egyptians describe is dramatic and alarming. They tell of a great movement of peoples, a confederation of different groups coming against Egypt, attacking by sea and by land, a vast and threatening force surging toward the heart of the Egyptian world. The Egyptian accounts are vivid. They describe these peoples as coming from the sea, from the islands and coasts, a coalition of various named groups joined together in a great migratory and military movement. They describe a force that had already, according to the Egyptian telling, swept across other lands, toppling kingdoms, leaving destruction in its wake before turning toward Egypt. The Egyptian records present the Sea Peoples as a great wave of destruction rolling across the world, overwhelming the powers in their path, a confederation of peoples on the move, bringing down civilization after civilization until they reached Egypt, where the pharaohs proclaim they were finally met and defeated. And Egypt did fight them in great battles that the pharaohs commemorated as major victories. The temple walls depict these battles, including dramatic scenes of naval combat, of Egyptian forces meeting the enemy ships, of fierce fighting on the water and the land. The Egyptians portray themselves as triumphant, as having defeated the Sea Peoples, as having repelled the great invasion and saved Egypt from the fate that had befallen so many other lands. The carvings show the enemy defeated, captured, driven off. Egypt survived, the pharaohs proclaimed, because it met the Sea Peoples in battle and overcame them. And the imagery is striking, the enemy warriors with their distinctive equipment and appearance, their ships, their people carved into the stone, a portrait of the invaders preserved by those who claim to have defeated them. This is the dramatic picture, the one that has captured the imagination. A great confederation of mysterious peoples surging out of the sea, sweeping across the ancient world, toppling the Hittites and the cities of the coast, burning Ugarit, rolling toward Egypt in a tide of destruction, the villains of the collapse, the force that ended the Bronze Age. It is a vivid and powerful image, and it has dominated the popular understanding of the catastrophe. The Sea Peoples as the destroyers, the invaders who brought down the world. And now, as we have promised to do throughout this journey, we must examine this picture honestly, because the honest truth is that the Sea Peoples are far more mysterious and far less understood than the dramatic version suggests. And here the mystery is genuine, acknowledged by the historians themselves, not a manufactured puzzle. Let us be clear and careful about what we actually know and what we do not. Start with the most basic question: who were they? Where did they come from? And the honest answer is that we genuinely do not know, not with certainty. The Egyptian records give names for the various groups in the Confederation, but identifying those names with known peoples or places is enormously difficult and deeply contested. Scholars have proposed many origins for the various Sea Peoples, connecting them to different regions of the Mediterranean, to various islands and coasts, to peoples we know from other sources and peoples we do not. Some of these proposed identifications are more plausible than others, but none is certain, and the debate remains genuinely open. We have names carved in Egyptian stone, but we cannot reliably attach those names to specific known origins. The Sea Peoples, in a real sense, are an enemy we cannot fully identify, a force whose homelands and identities remain, after all this time, genuinely uncertain. They are, quite literally, invaders nobody can confidently name. The uncertainty goes deeper still, to the very nature of what the Sea Peoples were. The dramatic image is of a unified invading army, a coordinated military confederation bent on conquest. But the evidence is far more ambiguous, and scholars now think the reality may have been quite different. There are strong indications that the Sea Peoples were not simply, or not only, a raiding army, but something more like a migration, a movement of whole peoples, including families, seeking new homes. The Egyptian records themselves in places describe not just warriors, but the movement of peoples with their possessions, suggesting a migratory character, populations on the move, looking to settle rather than merely an army bent on plunder. If this is right, then the Sea Peoples were not just invaders, but migrants, refugees perhaps, whole populations displaced from their homelands and moving in search of new places to live. And that raises a profound question about cause and effect, to which we will return. And there is an even more fundamental uncertainty, one that transforms the whole picture. Were the Sea Peoples the cause of the collapse, or were they a symptom of it? The dramatic version casts them as the cause, the invaders who brought down the world, but many historians now suspect the opposite, or at least something more complicated. What if the Sea Peoples were not the primary cause of the collapse, but themselves a product of it? What if they were peoples who had been displaced, uprooted, set in motion by the very catastrophe that was engulfing the region, by drought, by famine, by the collapse of their own homelands? What if the movement of the Sea Peoples was not the disease, but a symptom, one of the effects of a deeper crisis? Populations fleeing their ruined lands and crashing into other lands in turn, spreading the collapse further as they went. On this understanding, the Sea Peoples are not the villains who caused the catastrophe, but among its victims, driven from their homes by the same forces that were bringing down the whole world and becoming, in their desperate migration, one more mechanism by which the collapse spread. Do you see how the whole picture shifts? The dramatic image of a mysterious enemy surging out of nowhere to destroy the world may have the causation backwards, or at least incomplete. The Sea Peoples may have been as much a consequence of the collapse as a cause of it, displaced peoples set in motion by a catastrophe already underway, contributing to the destruction not as its origin but as part of its cascade. They are less likely to be the single explanation for the collapse, and more likely to be one thread in a much larger and more complex tapestry of causes, themselves entangled in the very crisis they are often blamed for. So the honest verdict on the Sea Peoples is this: they are real. The Egyptian records genuinely describe battles against invading forces from the sea, and the last letters of cities like Ugarit genuinely describe enemy ships attacking and burning. Something did come from the sea, and it was part of the catastrophe. But almost everything beyond that basic fact is uncertain. We do not know for sure who they were or where they came from. We do not know whether they were primarily an army or a migration. And most importantly, we do not know whether they were a cause of the collapse or a symptom of it, or most likely some complex combination, both driven by the crisis and contributing to it. The Sea Peoples are not the solution to the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse. They are themselves one of its deepest mysteries, an enemy we cannot name, whose very role in the catastrophe remains genuinely unresolved. And this is precisely why the popular focus on the Sea Peoples as the villains of the collapse is, in the honest assessment, almost certainly too simple. A movement of peoples, however destructive, does not by itself explain why an entire interconnected world of great powers collapsed so completely and so nearly simultaneously. Invasions and migrations have happened throughout history without bringing down whole civilizations across a whole region at once. If the Sea Peoples were part of the story, and they surely were, they were not the whole story, and probably not even the deepest part of it. To explain a collapse of this scale, we have to look beyond any single invading enemy to the deeper forces that may have set the whole catastrophe in motion. including the very forces that may have driven the sea peoples from their own homes in the first place. And that means turning from the human enemy to the natural one, from the invaders on the sea to the changing sky and the failing soil. Because the explanation that modern science increasingly favors for the deepest roots of the collapse is not an army at all. It is a change in the climate, a drying of the world, a great drought and the famine that followed, a slow environmental catastrophe unfolding beneath the sudden and violent fall. Let us turn now to the sky and the soil, to the evidence that the Bronze Age world may have been undone, in the end, not only by enemies from the sea, but by the failure of the rains. Let us examine the theory of climate and famine. If the sea peoples cannot bear the full weight of explaining the collapse, if a movement of peoples, however destructive, is not enough to bring down an entire interconnected world of great powers, then we must look deeper for a force with the reach and the power to undermine a whole civilization across a whole region at once. And in recent decades, the evidence has increasingly pointed toward a culprit that is quieter than any army, slower than any invasion, but ultimately far more powerful: the climate, the changing sky, and the failing soil beneath it, a great drought, and the famine that followed. This is the explanation that modern science increasingly favors for the deepest roots of the collapse, and it rests not on ancient carvings of triumphant pharaohs, but on hard physical evidence drawn from the earth itself. Let us examine it. The idea, in its essence, is this: that around the time of the collapse, the climate of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East changed, becoming drier, that a period of significant drought settled over the region, reducing rainfall, diminishing the harvests, and undermining the agricultural foundation on which the entire civilization rested, and that this drought, sustained over time, produced famine, hunger, scarcity, and the desperate movements and conflicts that hunger drives, eating away at the foundations of the Bronze Age world until it collapsed. Not a sudden blow, but a slow strangulation, a gradual failure of the rains that starved a civilization from below. What makes this explanation so compelling and so different from the more speculative elements of our story is that it rests on real scientific evidence drawn from the physical record of the past climate. Scientists have ways of reconstructing the climate of ancient times, of reading the record of past rainfall and temperature preserved in the natural world. And several lines of this evidence have converged in recent years on the conclusion that the period of the Bronze Age collapse was indeed a time of increased dryness and drought in the region. Let us look at how we know this, because the methods are genuinely impressive and the evidence is real. One crucial line of evidence comes from pollen. It may sound humble, but it is powerful. Plants release pollen, and that pollen settles and accumulates in places where it is preserved over long periods, in the sediments at the bottoms of lakes and other bodies of water, building up in layers year after year, century after century. By taking cores from these sediments, drilling down through the accumulated layers, scientists can recover a record of the pollen deposited over thousands of years. And by studying which plants the pollen came from at different depths, corresponding to different times, they can reconstruct how the vegetation of a region changed. And changes in vegetation reflect changes in climate. When the pollen record shows a shift from the plants of a wetter environment to the plants of a drier one, it reveals that the climate was becoming drier. And pollen studies from the region have indicated exactly such a shift around the time of the collapse, evidence of a drying climate, a move toward more arid conditions recorded in the vegetation preserved in the sediments. The plants themselves, through their pollen, testify to a drying world. Other lines of evidence point the same way. Scientists study the sediments of lakes and seas for other indicators of past climate, chemical and physical signals that reflect how wet or dry, how warm or cool the conditions were at different times. They study the record preserved in formations that build up over time in caves, which can carry signals of past rainfall. They draw on a whole array of methods for reconstructing ancient climate, and a significant body of this evidence has converged on the picture of a drier period, a drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean and Near East around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. The scientific case for a climate shift toward drought at this period has grown considerably stronger in recent years, and it now stands as one of the most important and best supported elements in the whole investigation of the collapse. This is not speculation. It is physical evidence drawn from the earth, converging on a real environmental change. And the picture drawn from the science is confirmed hauntingly by the ancient written records themselves. Because if a great drought struck the region, we would expect to find, in the documents of the time, signs of famine, of grain shortage, of hunger, of the desperate measures that scarcity forces. And we do. The ancient records of the period contain references to famine, to shortages of grain, to urgent needs for food. There are texts that speak of hunger, of the desperate need for grain to be sent, of shortages threatening populations. There is correspondence concerning the urgent shipment of grain to relieve scarcity, appeals for food, indications of a region under the pressure of famine. The written records of the dying world speak in places of hunger and the desperate search for grain, precisely what we would expect if drought and crop failure were undermining the food supply. The science and the ancient documents point in the same direction, toward a world where the harvests were failing and the people were going hungry. Now, let us understand why drought and famine could be so catastrophic, so much more devastating than a mere invasion, because this is the key to the whole explanation. Think back to what we learned about the structure of this world. It was a complex, interconnected civilization, with dense populations, centralized palace economies, and deep dependence on agriculture and trade. Such a civilization rests ultimately on its food supply, on the reliable production of grain to feed its populations, its cities, its armies, its administrations. Agriculture is the foundation of everything, and agriculture depends on the climate, on the rains, on the reliable turning of the seasons. If the rains fail, if drought settles in, and the harvests diminish year after year, the foundation begins to crumble. And in a complex, interconnected, densely populated society, the failure of the food supply is not a minor problem. It is an existential one, and its effects cascade through the whole system. Famine means hunger, and hunger means desperation. It means people unable to feed themselves, populations under unbearable pressure. It means the palace economies, which depended on agricultural surpluses to function, losing their foundation, unable to collect and redistribute the grain that held the system together. It means social unrest, as hungry populations turn against the authorities who cannot feed them. It means movement, migration, as people abandon lands that can no longer sustain them and go in search of places that can, crashing into other populations, spreading conflict and disruption. It means the weakening of every institution, the fraying of every bond, as the fundamental business of survival becomes impossible. A sustained drought in a civilization like this does not just cause hunger, it pulls the foundation out from under the entire structure. And here we can connect the climate explanation back to the sea peoples and see how the pieces might fit together. Remember the possibility that the sea peoples were not primarily invaders, but migrants, whole peoples displaced from their homelands, set in motion by catastrophe. What could have displaced them? What could have driven whole populations from their homes to seek new lands across the sea? Drought and famine. If the climate shift struck their homelands too, if their own agriculture failed, if their own people faced starvation, then they might have been driven to migrate, to seek new lands, to move in desperate search of places that could still feed them. On this understanding, the sea peoples and the climate crisis are not separate explanations, but parts of the same story. The drought drove the migrations, and the migrations spread the collapse. The failing rains uprooted peoples and set them in motion, and those uprooted peoples became one more force tearing at an already weakening world. So the climate and famine explanation is powerful, well-supported, and increasingly favored, and it has the reach and the depth to help explain a collapse of this magnitude in a way that a mere invasion never could. A great drought striking a complex, interconnected, agriculture-dependent civilization, undermining its food supply, producing famine, driving migration and unrest and conflict, eating away at the foundations of the whole system. This is a force with the power to bring down a world, but we must be honest here too, and careful not to replace one oversimple story with another. The climate explanation, powerful as it is probably not by itself the complete answer. Drought and famine can devastate a civilization, but the picture of the collapse is complex, and there were other forces at work as well, other blows falling on the Bronze Age world in the same terrible period. There were, the evidence suggests, earthquakes. There was war and raiding. There was internal collapse, rebellion, the breakdown of the social order from within. The climate crisis may have been the deepest and most powerful force, the one that set the whole catastrophe in motion. But it acted alongside and through a whole tangle of other causes, each contributing to the ruin. To complete our understanding, we must look at these other forces too, at the earth shaking and the fires of war and the collapse from within. Let us turn now to earth and fire, to the earthquakes, the wars, and the rebellions that completed the destruction of the Bronze Age world. The drought and famine may have been the deepest force undermining the Bronze Age world, the slow strangulation beneath the sudden fall. But a great civilization does not collapse from a single cause, and the evidence suggests that in this terrible period, blow after blow fell upon the ancient world, a convergence of catastrophes striking almost together. Alongside the failing climate came other forces, more sudden, more violent, each contributing to the ruin. The earth itself shook. Wars and raiding spread across the destabilized world, and within the kingdoms, the social order broke down, rebellion and collapse eating the civilization from the inside. To complete our understanding of the catastrophe, we must examine these other forces, the earth and the fire that helped bring the world down. Let us look at them in turn. Begin with the earth, with the possibility of earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean is a seismically active region, a place where the earth is prone to shaking, where earthquakes have struck throughout history and continue to strike today. And there is evidence at a number of the sites destroyed around the time of the collapse of earthquake damage, of destruction that bears the signature not of human violence, but of the earth itself convulsing, walls thrown down, structures collapsed in the characteristic patterns that earthquakes produce. And this has led to a striking idea, the notion of an earthquake storm. An earthquake storm is a real seismological phenomenon. in which a sequence of earthquakes occurs over a period of time along a system of geological faults, one quake following another as stress is transferred along the faults, producing a cluster of seismic events across a region over years or decades. And some scholars have proposed that such an earthquake storm may have struck the eastern Mediterranean around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, a series of powerful earthquakes over a span of time, damaging or destroying city after city, contributing to the wave of destruction that swept the region. If this is right, then some of the destruction we attribute to invasion or war may in fact have been the work of the earth. Cities shaken down by seismic catastrophe, their walls toppled and their buildings ruined by the convulsions of the ground. Now, we must be careful and honest here, because the earthquake explanation, like all the others, has its limits and its uncertainties. Earthquakes certainly can destroy cities, and there is genuine evidence of earthquake damage at some sites from this period. But earthquakes alone cannot explain the whole collapse. Earthquakes are local and regional, and while an earthquake storm could damage many cities over time, it is hard to see how seismic activity by itself could bring down an entire interconnected civilization across the whole region, could cause the loss of writing, the breaking of trade, the disappearance of empires. Moreover, a city damaged by an earthquake can usually be rebuilt, as cities in seismic regions have been rebuilt throughout history. The earthquakes, if they occurred, were more likely one contributing factor among many, one more blow falling on an already weakened world, adding to the destruction and the disruption than the single cause of the collapse. They are part of the picture, a real and violent part, but not the whole of it. Turn now to fire, to war and raiding. The Bronze Age collapse was, unmistakably, a violent event. The destruction layers in the earth, the burned cities, the last letters describing enemy ships and burning towns, all testified to widespread violence, to war, to raiding, to the burning of cities across the region. Whatever the deeper causes, the collapse involved a great deal of actual fighting, of cities attacked and destroyed by force, of a world descending into violence and warfare. The sea peoples, whoever they were part of this, attacking and burning. But the violence was surely broader than any single enemy, a general breakdown into war and raiding as the order of the world came apart. And this violence has its own logic, which connects it to the other causes. In a world under stress, a world of drought and famine and displacement, violence spreads. Hungry, desperate people raid and fight for the resources they need. Displaced populations on the move clash with the peoples whose lands they enter. The breakdown of central authority removes the forces that had kept order and suppressed raiding. As the interconnected system frays, as trade breaks down and scarcity spreads, the incentives and the opportunities for violence multiply. War and raiding, in this understanding, are partly a consequence of the deeper crisis, the drought and famine and displacement expressing themselves in a general spread of violence, cities falling not to a single organized invader, but to a rising tide of conflict and raiding as the whole order collapsed. The fire that consumed the cities was fed by the deeper failures beneath, and now turned to the collapse from within, to internal breakdown, rebellion, and the failure of the social order. This is a subtler force than earthquake or invasion, but it may be one of the most important, and it connects deeply to the structure of this world that we examined earlier. Remember the palace economies, the centralized systems through which the wealth and the goods of these societies were managed and redistributed. These systems concentrated power and wealth in the palaces and the elites, and they depended on the continued functioning of a complex administration, on the continued flow of surpluses, on the continued acceptance of the social order by the populations beneath. Now imagine what happens to such a system under the stress of drought, famine, and disruption. The surpluses fail. The palace can no longer collect and redistribute the grain that held the system together. The elites, concentrated in their palaces, may hoard what remains or prove unable to provide for the populations who depended on them. The ordinary people, facing hunger while the system that was supposed to sustain them fails, may turn against it. There may be rebellion, revolt, the rising up of populations against the palace elites who could no longer feed or protect them. Or there may be simple abandonment, people walking away from a system that no longer served them, the administrative order dissolving as the people who sustained it withdrew their labor and their allegiance. The centralized palace system, so efficient in good times, could shatter catastrophically when its foundation of surplus and stability was pulled away, collapsing from within as its own people turned against it or abandoned it. And this internal fragility connects to everything else. The palace economies were points of concentration and vulnerability. When they failed, the whole sophisticated apparatus of the civilization, the administration, the record-keeping, the organized trade, the redistribution of goods, failed with them. The loss of writing itself may be connected to this, for writing in these societies was largely a tool of the palace administrations, and when the palaces collapsed, the need for and the practice of writing could vanish with them. The scribes gone, the system they served dissolved, the collapse from within, the breakdown of the palace order may be one of the crucial mechanisms by which a wealthy, literate, sophisticated civilization could fall so completely into a dark age, its very capacity for writing and administration extinguished along with the palaces that had sustained them. So we have now assembled a whole array of forces, a catalogue of catastrophes, each contributing to the fall of the Bronze Age world. The drought and famine undermining the agricultural foundation, the migrations and invasions, the sea peoples and others set in motion by the crisis and spreading it further, the earthquakes shaking down cities in a seismic storm, the war and raiding, a general spread of violence as the order collapsed, and the internal breakdown, the failure and rebellion and abandonment of the palace systems collapsing the civilization from within. Each of these is real, each is supported by evidence, and each contributed to the ruin. But notice something crucial as we survey them. No single one of these forces by itself seems sufficient to explain the whole catastrophe. Drought alone, or earthquakes alone, or invasion alone, or internal collapse alone, none of them fully accounts for the scale, the speed, and the completeness of the fall, for the way an entire interconnected world of great powers came down almost simultaneously. Each explanation has its power, and each has its limits. And this is the great puzzle that has led historians in recent years toward a different kind of answer, an answer not about any single cause, but about how multiple causes striking together upon an interconnected system could combine into a catastrophe far greater than any one of them alone. This is the idea of the perfect storm of systems collapse of the cascade, and it may be the closest thing we have to a true solution to the mystery. Let us turn to it now and see how the many causes may have combined to end a world. We have surveyed the forces that fell upon the Bronze Age world, and we have found something both frustrating and illuminating. Each explanation, taken alone, is insufficient. The sea peoples cannot bear the full weight. Drought and famine, powerful as they were, do not by themselves account for everything. Earthquakes were local, war was a symptom as much as a cause. Internal collapse was one mechanism among many. Every single cause explanation, examined honestly, falls short of explaining the sheer scale and completeness and simultaneity of the catastrophe. And this repeated failure of single causes is not a dead end. It is, in fact, the clue that points toward the real answer. Because perhaps the reason no single cause can explain the collapse is that no single cause produced it. Perhaps the collapse was not the work of one villain, but of many forces converging at once, combining and amplifying one another into a perfect storm. Let us examine this idea, the modern understanding toward which the evidence increasingly points, and which may be the closest thing we have to a solution. Begin with the honest recognition that has driven historians toward this view. For a long time, the search for the cause of the Bronze Age collapse was a search for the cause, a single explanation, one force that could account for it all. Was it the sea peoples? Was it drought? Was it earthquakes? Each theory had its champions, each proposed a single primary cause. But as the evidence accumulated, a realization grew. None of them worked alone. Each could explain part of the picture, but none could explain all of it. And rather than concluding that the mystery was insoluble, historians began to consider a different kind of explanation altogether. What if the search for a single cause was itself the mistake? What if the collapse was precisely the kind of event that does not have a single cause, but arises from the convergence of many? This is the idea of the perfect storm, and it is worth understanding clearly because it represents a genuinely different way of thinking about catastrophe. A perfect storm is what happens when multiple factors, each perhaps manageable on its own, strike together at the same time, combining and reinforcing one another to produce a disaster far greater than any of them would have caused alone. It is not that one factor was the real cause and the others were incidental. It is that the simultaneous convergence of all of them, the way they fed into one another and amplified one another, was the cause. The catastrophe was an emergent property of the combination, something that arose from the coming together of the forces, and that none of them would have produced separately. Apply this to the Bronze Age collapse, and imagine how the forces we have examined might have converged and amplified one another. Picture the sequence, the cascade, as it might have unfolded. The climate shifts, and drought settles over the region. The drought causes crop failures, and crop failures cause famine. The famine weakens the palace economies, which depended on agricultural surpluses, and undermines the authority of the elites, who can no longer feed their people. The famine also drives migration, as populations abandon lands that can no longer sustain them, and these displaced peoples move, clashing with others, spreading disruption, some of them perhaps becoming the sea peoples, crashing into the kingdoms in their path. The movements and the scarcity spread violence, war, and raiding across the region. The trade routes on which the whole interconnected system depended break down amid the chaos, and the breakdown of trade cuts off the supply of essential goods, including the tin needed for bronze, further weakening every kingdom. Perhaps earthquakes strike amid all this, shaking down cities already reeling. And within the kingdoms, the stressed populations rebel or abandon the failing palace systems, collapsing the civilization from within. Each of these feeds the others, each makes the others worse, and together they bring down the whole world. Do you see the terrible logic of it? No single blow was necessarily fatal. A civilization might survive a drought or an earthquake or a wave of raiders or a period of internal unrest. Any one of these, met on its own, might be endured and recovered from, but all of them at once striking a single interconnected system, each amplifying the others, feeding a cascade of failure that spread through the connections of the world. This was more than any civilization could bear. The perfect storm was not any one of the catastrophes. It was the convergence of all of them, the way they combined into a single overwhelming crisis that no kingdom could withstand. And here we return to the crucial insight we planted earlier, the insight about interconnection, because it is the key that makes the perfect storm so devastating. Remember that the Bronze Age world was not a set of independent kingdoms, but a deeply interconnected system bound together by trade, by the dependence on bronze, by the flow of goods, by the web that linked every part to every other. And we noted that such interconnection, so powerful a source of prosperity in good times, carries a hidden vulnerability. In an interconnected system, failures do not stay contained. They spread, they cascade. A disruption in one part propagates through the connections to the whole. This is the phenomenon that scholars call systems collapse, and it is the deepest and most powerful concept in the whole modern understanding of the Bronze Age catastrophe. A complex interconnected system, precisely because it is interconnected, is vulnerable to a particular kind of failure in which the connections that made it strong become the channels through which collapse propagates. When one part fails, the parts connected to it are stressed and may fail in turn, stressing the parts connected to them in a chain reaction that spreads through the whole system. The very interconnection that made the system prosperous and efficient becomes, in crisis, the mechanism of its total collapse. The web that carried the goods carries the catastrophe. The system fails not part by part in isolation, but all together in a cascade, because everything is connected to everything else. This is why the Bronze Age collapse was so total, so widespread, so nearly simultaneous. It was not that the same disaster happened independently to each kingdom at the same time by coincidence. It was that the kingdoms were parts of a single interconnected system, and when that system began to fail, the failure cascaded through the connections, bringing down the whole. The fall of one part stressed the others. The breaking of trade hurt everyone at once. The collapse of one kingdom sent shocks through all the kingdoms tied to it. The interconnection that had bound the world together in prosperity now bound it together in ruin, transmitting the collapse from end to end until the whole glittering system had come down together. The Bronze Age world collapsed as a system all at once because it had lived as a system all together. So the modern understanding toward which the evidence points is this. The Bronze Age collapse was not caused by any single force. It was a systems collapse, a cascade, a perfect storm in which multiple stresses, drought and famine, migration and invasion, earthquake and war and internal breakdown, converged upon a deeply interconnected civilization and set off a chain reaction of failure that spread through the connections of the world and brought down the whole. The drought may have been the deepest trigger, the initial stress that set the cascade in motion, but it was the convergence of many forces striking an interconnected and therefore vulnerable system that produced the total catastrophe. The collapse was a property of the whole system under stress, not the work of any single cause. And this understanding, let us be honest, is both satisfying and humbling. It is satisfying because it makes sense of the evidence, explaining why no single cause seemed sufficient, and why the collapse was so total and so nearly simultaneous. It fits the facts better than any single cause theory. But it is humbling too, because it means the mystery, in a sense, has no simple answer, no single villain, no one explanation we can point to and say, this is what ended the world. The answer is complexity itself, the terrible vulnerability of an interconnected system to a convergence of stresses, the way a whole world can come down not from one great blow, but from many blows striking together upon a system too interconnected to contain the failure. It is a subtler, deeper, and more unsettling answer than any single cause could provide. And it is unsettling for another reason, the deepest reason of all, the reason this ancient catastrophe reaches across 3,000 years and touches us directly. Because the thing that made the Bronze Age world so vulnerable, its deep interconnection, its complex interdependence, its systemic integration, is precisely the thing that most characterizes our own world. We too live in a globalized, interconnected, deeply interdependent civilization, bound together by trade and supply chains and systems that link every part of the world to every other. And if the deepest lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is that interconnected systems are vulnerable to cascading, systemic collapse under a convergence of stresses, then that lesson is not only about the ancient past, it is a mirror held up to our own world, and what it reflects is unsettling. It is time to look into that mirror honestly and carefully and to confront what the year the world ended might have to say to us. Let us turn now to the long dark that followed the collapse and to the unsettling parallel with our own age. The collapse was not the end of the story. After the world ended, something followed. Not a swift recovery, not a quick rebuilding, but a long darkness, an age of diminishment and loss that settled over the ruined world and endured for centuries. And it is in the character of that long dark and in the deepest lessons of the whole catastrophe that we find the unsettling mirror this ancient collapse holds up to our own connected and fragile world. Let us examine first the darkness that followed, and then, honestly and carefully, what it might have to say to us. When the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age collapsed, what followed in many regions was a genuine dark age, a prolonged period of decline, simplification, and loss. And the losses were profound, striking at the very achievements that had defined the glittering world. Consider what was lost. The cities shrank or were abandoned entirely. The great urban centers, the hubs of the interconnected world, many of them were never rebuilt, left in ruins, their populations scattered or gone. Where cities survived or re-emerged, they were often smaller, poorer, diminished shadows of what had been. The dense, urban, sophisticated world of the Bronze Age gave way, in many places, to a sparser, poorer, more rural existence. Populations reduced, the great centers of population and power gone. The trade networks broke and did not quickly recover. The long-distance connections that had bound the world together, that had carried the tin and the copper and the grain and the luxury goods across the region, were shattered, and the flow of goods dwindled. The interconnected economy that had made the Bronze Age world so rich came apart, and with it went much of the prosperity it had produced. The world became more isolated, more fragmented, each diminished region thrown back more on its own meager resources, the great web of exchange broken. And most hauntingly of all, in some places, writing itself was lost. This is one of the most striking and sobering facts of the whole collapse. In the Mycenaean world of Greece, the system of writing that had been used to keep the palace records simply disappeared, vanished from use, and Greece entered a period of centuries during which it was effectively illiterate, a world that had once written now unable to write, the very knowledge of the script lost. Writing would eventually return to Greece, but only after a long dark age, and in an entirely different form, a new script adopted much later. The loss of writing is the starkest possible symbol of how deep the collapse went. Literacy, that fundamental achievement of civilization, that hard-won capacity to record and remember, was not merely interrupted, but forgotten, lost so completely that it had to be reinvented or reacquired from scratch centuries later. A world that had been literate went silent and stayed silent for generations. Think about what that means. The collapse did not just destroy cities and break trade. It rolled back civilization itself, undoing achievements that had taken ages to build, plunging a literate, urban, sophisticated world into centuries of darkness and diminishment. This was not a temporary setback. It was a profound and lasting regression, a genuine dark age from which the recovery would take centuries and from which some things would never return in the same form. The world that eventually rose from the ruins was a new world, built on the wreckage of the old, and much of what the old world had achieved was gone forever or had to be laboriously rebuilt from the beginning. And yet let us hold the other side of this too, for the story is not one of pure and permanent loss. Out of the ruins, slowly, new things did arise. The Dark Age was not eternal. Eventually, over centuries, recovery came, and new civilizations rose from the wreckage of the old. In Greece, out of the long Dark Age that followed the Mycenaean collapse, there would eventually emerge the classical Greek civilization, one of the most influential in all of history, rising from the ruins of the Bronze Age world. New peoples, new powers, new orders took shape in the transformed world. The collapse cleared the ground, in a sense, for new growth, and the world that eventually emerged was different, and in some ways would achieve things the Bronze Age world never had. History did not end with the collapse. It entered a new and different chapter after a long and painful darkness. The end of that world was also, eventually, the beginning of another. But now we come to the deepest and most unsettling dimension of this whole story, the reason the Bronze Age collapse reaches across 3,000 years and speaks to us with such disquieting force. The mirror. Because the world that collapsed was, in its essential character, unsettlingly like our own. And the lesson of its fall is one we cannot entirely dismiss as ancient history. Consider the parallel, honestly. The late Bronze Age world was globalized, in its way, an interconnected international system spanning a vast region, bound together by long-distance trade, by complex supply chains, by deep interdependence between its parts. No kingdom was self-sufficient. All depended on the networks of exchange, on the flow of essential goods across great distances, on the continued functioning of the interconnected system. It was sophisticated, prosperous, and, to those who lived within it, surely seemed permanent, an established order that had endured for centuries and would surely endure for centuries more. And it collapsed, not because any single enemy destroyed it, but because a convergence of stresses struck an interconnected system whose very interconnection made it vulnerable to cascading systemic failure. Now look at our own world. We too live in a globalized, interconnected civilization, bound together by international trade, by complex and far-reaching supply chains, by deep interdependence between nations and regions. We too depend on the continued flow of essential goods across great distances, on systems so interconnected that no part is truly self-sufficient. We too have built a sophisticated, prosperous, deeply integrated global order that to us seems established and enduring. And the deepest lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is that such systems, precisely because of their interconnection, carry a hidden vulnerability to cascading collapse under a convergence of stresses. The very interdependence that makes them prosperous makes them fragile in a particular way, vulnerable to the propagation of failure through their connections, to the perfect storm in which multiple shocks converge and amplify one another into a catastrophe greater than any single cause. That is the mirror, and it is genuinely unsettling. The Bronze Age collapse is not just a story about the distant past. It is a case study in how a sophisticated, interconnected, seemingly permanent civilization can collapse, and it reveals a vulnerability that our own civilization shares. It shows that interconnection, for all its benefits, has a dark side, that complex systems can fail catastrophically and all at once, that prosperity and permanence are not guaranteed, that a convergence of stresses, environmental, economic, social, can bring down even a mighty and sophisticated world. It stands as a warning, a real historical example of the fragility that lies hidden beneath the surface of every interconnected golden age. But now, having felt the force of the mirror, we must also be honest about its limits, because intellectual honesty requires us to see clearly where the parallel illuminates and where it should not be pushed too far. The mirror is real, but it is not a prophecy, and we must not let a genuine insight curdle into false certainty or empty alarmism. Consider the differences, which are real and important. Our world is vastly more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, and more capable than the Bronze Age world. We understand our climate, our systems, our vulnerabilities in ways the ancients could not. We have science, technology, communication, and global awareness that give us tools to anticipate, mitigate, and respond to crises that the Bronze Age world entirely lacked. We can measure a drought coming, model a systemic risk, coordinate a response across the globe. The Bronze Age world was blindsided by forces it could not understand or foresee. We are not so blind. The parallel of interconnection and systemic vulnerability is real, but our capacity to understand and respond to that vulnerability is incomparably greater. And that difference matters enormously. And we must resist the temptation, so common in this genre, to turn a genuine historical insight into a confident prediction of doom. The Bronze Age collapse does not prove that our world will collapse. It does not foretell our future. It is not a prophecy. It is a warning and an illustration, a real example of a real vulnerability. But the lesson it teaches is about a kind of risk, a pattern to be aware of and guard against, not a destiny to be resigned to. The honest use of the mirror is not to frighten ourselves with visions of inevitable collapse, but to understand, soberly and clearly, that interconnected systems carry systemic risks, that complexity has a hidden fragility, that no golden age is guaranteed to last, and that awareness of these truths is precisely what gives us the power to guard against them. The Bronze Age world fell in part because it could not see the forces converging upon it. We, who can study its fall, who can see the pattern, are in a fundamentally better position if we choose to learn the lesson. So the mirror illuminates a real truth, that interconnection breeds a particular fragility, that sophisticated systems can collapse, that permanence is never guaranteed, and it should sober us, make us humble, make us attentive to the systemic risks of our own interconnected world. But it should not paralyze us with fatalism, because the very act of studying the collapse, of understanding its lessons, of seeing the mirror clearly, is itself the antidote to the blindness that helped doom the Bronze Age world. The ancients could not learn from the collapse of a previous interconnected civilization because they had none to study. We can learn from theirs, and that capacity to learn, to see the pattern and guard against it, is the crucial difference, the reason the mirror should instruct us rather than terrify us. We have traveled the whole arc of the catastrophe now, from the glittering world through the collapse and the mystery of its causes to the long dark that followed, and the mirror it holds up to our own age. It remains only to gather what we have found, to stand back and reflect on the meaning of the year the world ended, on what we know and what we may never know, and on why this real apocalypse haunts us more than all the myths. Let us turn to our final reflection on the year the world ended. We began with a claim that might have seemed like the opening of just another tale of a lost world, that there was a time when the world really ended. But we have seen across this whole journey that this was no myth, no legend, no speculation about an unverifiable past. It was history. Real, documented, dated history. A genuine apocalypse that befell a real and recoverable world around 3,200 years ago and left its mark in the burned cities and the last letters and the destruction horizon that still runs through the earth. Now, at the end of our journey, let us gather what we have found and reflect on why the year the world ended still haunts us, more perhaps than all the myths of lost worlds combined. Let us remember first what we know, because it is a great deal and it is astonishing. We know that there was, in the late Bronze Age, a brilliant, interconnected, cosmopolitan civilization spanning the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, a world of great powers and long-distance trade, of kings who called each other brother and exchanged gifts of gold, of sophisticated palace economies and literate administrations and magnificent art, a whole international order at the height of its achievement. We know that this world collapsed almost in its entirety in the span of a few decades, around 1,200 years before the Common Era. We know that the Hittite Empire vanished so completely it was forgotten for millennia, that the Mycenaean world shattered into a dark age, that cities across the region were burned and many never rebuilt, that even mighty Egypt was crippled. We know that trade broke, that populations crashed, that in places writing itself was lost, and that a long darkness followed. All of this is established, documented, real. The collapse happened. Of that there is no doubt. And let us remember too what we do not know, because the honesty of not knowing is central to this whole story. We do not know with certainty what caused it. We do not know for sure who the sea peoples were, or where they came from, or whether they were a cause of the collapse or a symptom of it. We do not know exactly how the many forces, drought and famine, migration and invasion, earthquake and war and internal collapse, fit together, or which mattered most. What we have concluded, following the best modern understanding, is that there was probably no single cause at all, that the collapse was a perfect storm, a systems collapse, a cascade of converging catastrophes, striking an interconnected world whose very interconnection made it vulnerable to total simultaneous failure. That is the closest we can come to an answer. But it is an answer that preserves the mystery even as it explains it, an answer about complexity and convergence and fragility, not about a single villain we can name. The deepest question, why the world ended, has an answer that is itself a kind of humbling, a recognition of how a whole civilization can fall, not from one great blow, but from the terrible convergence of many. Now let us reflect on why this real apocalypse haunts us as it does, because it should by rights be less gripping than the great myths of lost worlds. It offers no drowned continent, no vanished super-civilization, no single dramatic cataclysm. It offers instead a tangle of causes, a systems collapse, a cascade of ordinary catastrophes, and yet it haunts us more deeply than any myth. And I think the reason is precisely that it is real. The myths of lost worlds, the drowned continents and prehistoric resets are thrilling, but they are safe in a way because they are not quite real, because we can hold them at the distance of legend, wonder at them without truly fearing them. But the Bronze Age collapse is not safe because it actually happened. It happened to real people in a real world, a world we can reconstruct in vivid detail, a world whose last letters we can read. And it happened to a world that was, in its essential character, unsettlingly like our own, connected, sophisticated, prosperous, seemingly permanent, and it ended anyway. That is why it haunts us, not because it is strange and distant, but because it is real and familiar, a genuine example of the very thing we most want to believe cannot happen, the collapse of a civilization like ours. There is a particular terror and a particular wisdom in that. The people of the late Bronze Age world surely believed their world would endure. The kings writing their letters, exchanging their gifts of gold, the merchants sailing their trade routes, the scribes keeping their records, they lived in an established order that had lasted for centuries, and they must have assumed, as we assume, that it would go on. And it did not. It ended in their own lifetimes in fire and collapse and darkness. The permanence they took for granted was an illusion. The golden age they lived in had a fragility they could not see. And that is the deepest and most sobering lesson of the whole story, the fragility that lies hidden beneath every golden age, the way even the most sophisticated and prosperous and seemingly permanent civilization can fall, and fall quickly when the forces converge. But let us not end in fear, because fear is not the right response, and it is not the honest one. The right response is a kind of sober wonder, a clear-eyed humility, and even a strange hope. Wonder at the reality of this ancient catastrophe, at the astonishing fact that we can reconstruct it, read its last letters, trace its destruction in the earth, and stand in imagination inside the year the world ended. Humility before the fragility it reveals, the recognition that no civilization, however great, is guaranteed to last, that interconnection breeds vulnerability, that permanence is never assured, and hope, real hope, in the fact that the story did not end with the collapse, that out of the long dark new worlds arose, that from the ruins of the Mycenaean world eventually came classical Greece. From the wreckage of the old order came new orders, new achievements, new civilizations. The collapse was an ending, but it was also, eventually, a beginning. History did not stop. It entered a new chapter after the darkness. And there is a final hope, the deepest of all, in the very fact that we can tell this story. The people of the Bronze Age could not learn from the collapse of a previous interconnected civilization because they had none to study. But we can learn from theirs. We can see the mirror, understand the pattern, recognize the fragility of interconnected systems, and perhaps guard against it. The Bronze Age world was blindsided. We need not be. The very act of remembering the year the world ended, of understanding how and why it fell, is itself a kind of protection, a wisdom the ancients could not have, a chance to see clearly what they could not see. The forgotten apocalypse remembered at last becomes not just a warning but a gift, a lesson from a lost world to our own. So look one last time at that glittering world of the late Bronze Age in the years before the fall. The great powers, the cosmopolitan trade, the kings and their letters, the palaces full of goods, the harbors full of ships, a whole connected civilization at the height of its glory, humming with life and commerce and art, certain of its own permanence. And then remember that it ended in a single generation, in fire and collapse and the long dark that followed. Remember the last letters of Ugarit, baked hard in the fire that killed the city, a cry for help frozen in the clay. Remember the empire so completely erased that the world forgot it had ever existed. Remember that it was real, all of it, the glory and the fall alike. The year the world ended was a real year, in a real world that really fell, and it has waited 3,000 years in the burned cities and the silent tablets and the destruction horizon in the earth, to be remembered and to tell us what it knows. That golden age's end, that connection is both strength and fragility, that no world is permanent, and that even after the world ends, if we are wise and fortunate, something new can rise from the ruins. What do you think? Was the fall of the Bronze Age a warning meant for us, a mirror of our own connected and fragile world? Or is our civilization different enough, wise enough, resilient enough to avoid the fate of that glittering lost age? Could a collapse like theirs happen to a world like ours? Or have we learned enough at last to see the storm before it comes? Tell us in the comments. This is a question worth carrying with us long after the story ends. If this journey into the year the world ended changed the way you see the past, and perhaps the present, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more of the true and forgotten stories of the worlds that came before ours.